Well, welcome to GovExperts Insights, where we talk about politics, policy, and the practice of both. Today, we're going to be talking about the United States Bill of Rights. On December 15th, 2023, we will celebrate the 232nd anniversary of the Bill of Rights adoption by the states. We have a special guest with us, Bill Pascoe, who has spent over 38 years championing liberty and helping to ensure that our democracy works and continues here in the United States. Bill's expertise has taken him all over the world, promoting and training foreign activists and the American democratic tradition. Welcome, Bill, to GovExperts Insights.
Chris, good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
You bet. Thanks. I'm excited for our conversation. Before we get started, Bill, I wanted to take a minute for you to talk a little bit about how you got started in your career, what drew you into the political arena, and perhaps some highlights as you look back upon the 38 years you've been involved.
Well, Chris, I was actually born in the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. And I grew up in Northern Virginia, just across the river, close to Mount Vernon, George Washington's estate. And when you grow up there, you get addicted to two things, politics and the Washington Redskins, unfortunately for both. So I grew up with an interest in politics. Everybody around me was interested in politics. It's a company town. If you want to make money, you go to New York. If you want to make movies, you go to Hollywood. If you want to do government and politics, there's no better place than Washington, D.C. And growing up there, the Washington Post was my hometown newspaper. You get inculcated with an interest in politics, and it started at a young age. I went to college and graduate school at the University of Virginia, which of course was founded by Thomas Jefferson. I started working in politics. The first paid job I ever had on a campaign, I was actually in college. I took a semester off in the fall of 1980. I first started working for Governor Reagan's campaign for president. And then I had an opportunity to go work in a congressional campaign, a highly targeted congressional campaign in Indiana, and I did that. So I had to come back to school and make up for that time off. I started working with the government when I came out with a graduate degree in foreign affairs in 1984. I worked for the State Department. And I went to work for the Heritage Foundation, a think tank that was right at the center of the action in the Reagan administration, and I wrote about activities in the Third World. That led me to a job working for a billionaire philanthropist by the name of Bob Kriebel, who hired me after the 1988 campaign to direct his philanthropy towards the Iron Curtain countries, what was going on behind the Iron Curtain. While I was at Heritage, I had participated in a project we called the Liberation Doctrine, where we wanted to take the Reagan Doctrine, which was the idea of providing assistance to armed military movements that were operating at the periphery of the Soviet Empire in places like Afghanistan and Angola and Nicaragua. We wanted to take that and we wanted to move it into the Soviet Empire itself. Political support, not armed military support, but political support to the democratic activists who were then operating in Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and even inside the Soviet Union itself. So he asked me he said, you've been writing about this for a couple of years. Why don't you come to work for me and you can actually make it happen? I'll give you a budget. So I spent 1989, I spent about 15 days a month in Central and Eastern Europe smuggling PCs and fax machines and cash behind the Iron Curtain. And then we actually began political training conferences. One of the Russian activists that I met with said, we love the hardware you're giving us, but we would love some software. I thought he was talking about actual computer software, maybe that would translate Cyrillic into English or back and forth. He said, no. He was talking about training, because he said, if there's one thing the communists are, it's organized. And we're worried that they're going to allow elections sooner rather than later, because they do know how to organize and we don't. We've been denied the ability to organize. We don't even know how to organize. Can you help with that? And so we began setting up training conferences to take place inside the Iron Curtain countries. We were actually in Moscow on November 9th, 1989, the day the Berlin Wall fell. We didn't know about it for 2 days because Soviet television and Soviet news was blacked out. The Soviet leaders didn't know what to do, and they started showing on Soviet television the endless loop of the May Day parade. And I knew from my graduate studies what that meant. When the Soviet leaders put the May Day parade on television on an endless loop, that means they don't know what to do. They don't know what they're going to tell the populace. 2 days later, we finally got through with a phone call. One of the guys on the trip finally got through to his wife who read him the newspaper that morning and said that the Berlin Wall was down, that East Germans were flowing over the wall to the west, and Westerners were flowing east, and nobody was shooting. And that was the beginning of the end. And then what happened was really fascinating, because it was just a few months later, in June of 1990, there were elections in Russia. That was the election where Boris Yeltsin was elected. The guy who ran Boris Yeltsin's campaign was a young man by the name of Alexander Ermanov, who had been trained by my team in November of 1989 in Moscow. In that very first training mission that we went behind the Iron Curtain, we helped train Boris Yeltsin's campaign manager. And then, as the parliamentarians began to wrestle with the question of what are we going to do now, they began to draft a new constitution, and they asked for help. Since we had helped them get elected, they figured, well, you must be experts not just in how you get elected, but what to do once you are elected. Well, obviously, that's a very different thing. But we were able to bring people in, professors of history, professors of constitutional law, became parts of the team, and they went over and they spent many months those first couple of years on the ground working with newly elected members of the legislatures in all those countries that we had been working in. And it was a fascinating process. And I can tell you, they looked to the American Constitution. Obviously, as you look at the constitutions now of those former Soviet satellite states, they didn't choose to replicate the American model. I think that's probably a good thing. The American model works for America. Our system of government works for us. We have a certain character. They have a different character. They have different traditions, and they ended up going with constitutions that they believed would do a better job of serving their needs, serving their governmental needs than the American Constitution did. But it was a fascinating experience, absolutely fascinating.
What a great vantage point to see and witness history unfolding, and then to be a part of it and to be supportive of democratic ideals expanding across the globe and things. Thank you so much for sharing that. So, as I mentioned earlier, on December 15th of this year, we're going to be celebrating 232 years since the United States Bill of Rights was ratified. Before we start talking about the Bill of Rights in detail, can you give us a little bit of history about how Bill of Rights Day came to be celebrated here in the States?
Yeah, we got to go back to 1941. 1941 was the 150th anniversary of the ratification of the Bill of Rights. And in November of 1941, the Congress passed a resolution asking President Roosevelt to proclaim that December 15th, 1941, the 150th anniversary of the ratification, would be known as Bill of Rights Day. And everybody in the United States should attend ceremonies and think about the Bill of Rights, and we should celebrate this and honor the Bill of Rights as would be appropriate. You may recall that in late November of 1941, early December of 1941, the president had other things on his mind. On December 7th, 1941, of course, we had the Pearl Harbor attack. On December 8th, he went to the Congress and he asked for a declaration of war. But he did, on December 15th, give a radio address in which he proclaimed the day Bill of Rights Day. And he said that he, in fact, worked it into the war pitch. He actually talked about how in America we are defending these rights. We have a government that gives these rights, that grants these rights, that protects these rights. And we are fighting against powers that would destroy these individual rights. So he actually found a way to work the Bill of Rights into the war pitch that he was then beginning to make for the first time. Then you fast forward to 1946. That's the next time the Congress sends the President of the United States a resolution saying, hey, remember Bill of Rights Day, please. And this time it's President Harry Truman. And so in December of 1946, Truman proclaimed Bill of Rights Day. December 15th, 1946 was Bill of Rights Day. And then he did so the following year in 1947, but then for some reason he forgot to do so in 1948. He didn't do anything in 1949, 1950, 51. In 1952, he mentions it, and it's President Eisenhower actually who decides that from now on we're going to make this a regular thing. We're going to celebrate it on the anniversary on December 15th every year from that point on. So the history was kind of muddled at the beginning. We had other things going on, but By the 1950s, we've actually got a day that it's recognized by the National Archives, for instance. You know, the Bill of Rights is one of the three documents that you will see when you walk into the National Archives. You see the Declaration of Independence, you see the Constitution of the United States, and you see the Bill of Rights. So to the historians, the archivists, to those of us who are interested in how the government of the United States is actually run, the Bill of Rights is an enormously important document, and we should recognize that on a regular basis. We've chosen December 15th simply because it's an easy day to remember on the calendar. That's the day that the final state ratified it, and it went into effect.
Am I wrong in my math and things? It took longer to decide to celebrate the Bill of Rights than it did to actually pass.
Well, you know, this is kind of interesting. There were 17 amendments when James Madison sat down as a member of the first Congress, right? He was elected in that very first Congress that the Constitution created. So he comes into office, and within just a couple months of coming into office, as part of the understanding that had been made, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but you got to remember the Bill of Rights was the payoff to a deal. As the states were considering ratifying the Constitution, the opposition, and there was opposition. Not everybody thought the Constitution was a great idea. George Mason in Virginia was one of the people, one of the great future leaders, one of the great future presidents, who was opposed originally to the ratification of the Constitution. He thought that the central government that it was creating was going to be much too powerful. So many people, they called themselves the anti-federalists, and they were opposed to the ratification of the Constitution because they believed that this government was going to be too powerful. They just fought a war to free themselves from what they believed was too powerful a government, and they didn't want to reestablish one. So they were very concerned about this. And the way that Madison and some of the other framers of the Constitution were able to assuage those concerns was to say, well, what if we agreed to write the Bill of Rights that you guys are talking about? I mean, we don't think we need a Bill of Rights because, you know, as we see it, the Constitution lays out the powers of the government, and it's very clear. If the Constitution does not specifically grant a certain power to the government, then the government doesn't have it. And everybody will know that. And the anti-federalists said, well, you know, you're far more trusting than we are of what a future government might behave, the way a future government might behave. We're not at all sure that just because the Constitution doesn't give them the power to do so as government officers, that they will therefore limit themselves to only the things that the government or that the Constitution says they can do. We would feel much more comfortable if there were actually a Bill of Rights listed in the Constitution that was just as important. So Madison gets to Congress and he sits down and he writes 17 amendments. 17 amendments get adopted by the House and go over to the Senate. The Senate says no to 5 of them and sends 12 of them out to the states. The President Washington, in October of 1789, sends a letter to the state legislatures and says, okay, here we've got a bunch of proposed amendments, 12 amendments to the Constitution. Please look at them and ratify them. Let us know what you think. So we've got 12 amendments that actually leave the Congress bound for the states and whether or not they're going to be ratified. 10 of them get adopted. That's what we call the Bill of Rights. But interestingly, the first 2 amendments, what we now call the First Amendment to the Constitution, the right to freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, that was actually the 3rd amendment on the list. The First Amendment on the list never did get ratified. The First Amendment on the list created an apportionment scheme. That is, how do you decide which states are going to have members of the House of Representatives? How many are going to go to Virginia? How many are going to go to Delaware and thus and such? So that was an amendment all about apportionment in the House of Representatives. It never got ratified. And since 1911, we do that by statute. In 1911, the Congress passed a law that what had happened until 1911 was every so often, as the country grew, the House of Representatives would grow. And it kept growing and growing and growing until it got to 435. And I think somebody finally woke up one morning and said, you know, we've about filled this building, every nook and cranny that we can. We don't have room for any more representatives. Let's stop it at 435, and we'll come up with a new way to apportion it to make sure that it's fair. And so we do that by statute. So that was the First Amendment. apportionment. It never got adopted. The Second Amendment is actually now the 27th Amendment to the Constitution, because even though it was sent out for ratification in 1789, it wasn't finally ratified by the 38th state until 1992. That's the congressional amendment, or that's the constitutional amendment that sets the compensation level, says that a Congress cannot vote to increase its own pay and then immediately turn around to the Treasury and say, okay, now give me my increased pay. It says that compensation changes, whether up or down, only go into effect beginning with the next Congress. So you can't vote yourself a pay increase. That was the Second Amendment. And then, of course, we have the 10 amendments that we now know. They get adopted over a period of, well, from October of 1789 until December of 1991. So it took a little more than 2 years for the requisite number of states to finally ratify. And now, during the process, and what happens here during the process, the reason we have a Bill of Rights, because we get 5 states into the process. 5 states, the first 5 states ratify the document between October of 1789 and January. Wait a minute, let me think here. Yeah, between October of 1789 and January, I'm sorry, we're talking about the Constitution, so we're talking about 1787, going from 1787 to 1788. By January of 1788, we've got 5 states that have ratified it. And then we begin to get this slowdown. The anti-federalists' arguments are beginning to work.
And Bill, was it primarily a division between the Federalist and the anti-Federalist, or were there are obviously geographic differences, but it wasn't all just North versus South, and it seemed to me as I read it things too that there was a limitations versus of the state and the federal government and how they share power, but also protections for the individual in there. I mean, can you talk a little bit about how that all the lines of the fissures that were developing during that time?
Well, you're right to point out that at initial glance you might think that the big distinction, the big dividing line was between North and South, and you might think that the issue was slavery. In fact, that wasn't it wasn't slavery itself. There were concerns in the South. The first people to really strongly oppose the ratification of the Constitution were Southerners, but it wasn't because of slavery. It was because the South, because of the agrarian economy, the Southern economy relied on trade with foreign powers, frankly. And they were worried that Northerners might dominate the government and put taxes on their exports and would therefore control the Southern economy by the use of taxation. So there was a North-South split, but it wasn't on the basis of slavery originally. Of course, in the Constitution itself, the Great Compromise ends up with, Southern states. Remember, we have this odious phrase, 3/5 of a person. When they drafted the Constitution for purposes of apportionment to decide how many seats were going to be apportioned to every state in the House of Representatives, the Southerners wanted every slave to be counted as a full individual because they wanted more seats in the House of Representatives. The North didn't want that. So the compromise they came up with was, we will count for purposes of apportionment, every white person will count as a person, and 3/5 of all other people will be counted. It was this terrible compromise when you stop to think of what they were actually doing, and eventually we fought a war over it to right that, and we changed that later. But that was part of the original compromise between the North and the South. Then you get into the question. Remember, even inside delegations, you got James Madison at the Constitutional Convention on the one hand from Virginia, arguing very strongly for this new central government, which needed more powers than the government created by the Articles of Confederation. But in the very same delegation, you've got George Mason, who's one of the leaders of the opposition. So it wasn't just North versus South. There were people inside relevant state delegations who were opposed to one another, who had different thoughts about the construct of this new government. And so what you end up having is the Bill of Rights is offered as an inducement to those people who opposed the ratification of the Constitution, who were worried that we were creating too powerful a central government. The Federalists, the ones who supported the Constitution and wanted to see it ratified, they said to the anti-Federalists, okay, what if we give you a Bill of Rights? Will that make you happy? Will that get you to vote to ratify? And eventually, that's the deal that's signed off. So Madison comes to office in that very first Congress, and he immediately gets to work writing the amendments that will become the Bill of Rights, and they get that process started.
Once
that's how it comes to be.
Bill, once they brokered that deal, was there implicit that both the anti-Federalists and the Federalists supported the Bill of Rights package? Because you had five states that had already passed, you had the distinctions between the two and where they need to be. There had to be a lot of trust that after the Constitution was ratified, that the states were then going to pass and ratify those Bill of Rights. And not all of them did, but were people generally happy with the fact that how the process went?
I think they were. I think they were. And of course, one of the things that we get as a result of the ratification debates over the Constitution itself, you've got to remember, so you get to New York State. You've got five states basically almost right out of the gate agree to ratify. And then you begin to get in, and Pennsylvania was one of them. Pennsylvania was one of the biggest states in the Union at the time. It was one of the wealthiest states in the Union, and it ratified very early on. You get to the other two big states, New York and Virginia, and they're at opposite ends. One is a northern state, one is a southern state, one is a commercial and mercantile state, the banking center, and the other is the leader of the agrarian economy in the South, reliant on the slave trade, and the ratification debate in those two states, in particular in New York, a guy shows up and starts writing essays under a pen name. He uses the name Cato, the Roman citizen of antiquity. So Alexander Hamilton sees this and goes to Madison and John Jay and says, we got to do something about this. And the next thing you know, the three of them combine to write a series of anonymously published essays. They take the name Publius. And over the next several months, they publish 85 different essays, 51 of which were drafted by Alexander Hamilton himself. Those documents they're op-ed pieces is what they are. They're a little bit longer than an op-ed piece, maybe magazine length in most cases, to be honest. But those 85 individual essays addressing all different aspects of the Constitution. Why did we put this in Article 1? Let's talk about the executive power in this article. And you get into what Thomas Jefferson later called the greatest commentary on government by men. And that's how the Federalist Papers came to be. The Federalist Papers were simply a series of op-ed articles that were written by John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison for the purpose of arguing in favor of ratification of the Constitution. They did so, now interestingly, they did so anonymously because they didn't want their personalities. They were well-known men at the time, and they didn't want their personalities to infect, one way or the other, an individual's consideration of the argument that they were making. They said, we want the argument to stand on its own. We don't want it to be infected by what people might think about us, whether it's positive or negative. The argument should stand on its own. So here's the argument. Here's Federalist number 10. Here's Federalist paper number 51. And eventually, you do get ratification of the Constitution. One of the things that's interesting is, by the time that we had the first Congress was inaugurated on March 4, 1789. That's the first day of session of the first Congress of the United States. North Carolina hadn't elected anybody to that Congress because North Carolina had not yet ratified the Constitution. Well, if you haven't ratified the Constitution, you can't have an election, obviously, under that Constitution. So North Carolina quickly ratifies the Constitution and then holds elections so they can send people to represent North Carolina in this new government that's just been formed. It's fascinating, what took place at the very beginning. It wasn't for another, I think it was a month and a half before there was actually a quorum present so that the Congress could do business. George Washington was not inaugurated on March 4, 1789. That was the day that he was supposed to be inaugurated, but there wasn't a quorum to do business, so he actually didn't get inaugurated until April of 1789. So those early days were rather chaotic, but you've got people paying off on the deal they had made. That's what the Bill of Rights was. It was the payoff for a deal. And again, the interesting thing about it is not that to get to your question of, is everybody satisfied with the Bill of Rights? Do the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists together agree on the Bill of Rights? The people remember, the people who demanded the Bill of Rights be specifically written in were the Anti-Federalists, because they didn't trust what a future government would do. The Federalists didn't oppose a Bill of Rights. They just thought that it wasn't necessary because it didn't occur to them that a future government would try to extend its powers beyond those that were explicitly written into the Constitution. And in fact, the last two amendments, the 9th Amendment and the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, the last two amendments in the Bill of Rights specifically deal with that question. The 9th Amendment basically says, by the way, just because we put something in this Constitution specifically doesn't mean that if it isn't in the Constitution, it isn't your right. There are other rights that individuals and states have that aren't listed here in this Constitution. Just because we haven't listed it here doesn't mean you don't have that right. And then the 10th Amendment says, and by the way, the flip side is also true. If the Constitution does not grant to the federal government a specific right, then that right is reserved to the states or to the people. So they actually deal in the amendments themselves, in the Bill of Rights themselves, they address this question of how powerful do we think the government is going to be. They wanted to make very clear, and as you go through not just the Bill of Rights, but as you go through the Constitution itself, what you see is this is a limiting document. This is a document that sets limits on government. What are the first 5 words of the First Amendment? Congress shall make no law. Now, there are some conservatives who for years have suggested that should be an amendment itself. We should just take the first 5 words of the First Amendment and offer that as an amendment to the Constitution and be done with it. Congress shall make no law. I think that's a little bit extreme. But the idea is that we're going to limit the power of government. That's what the Constitution is. It's a contract between government and the people in which limits on government are enumerated. And that's why but we get really specific. We're going to really pound this point home that government is only here to do those things that we empower government to do specifically. That's what the 9th and 10th Amendments are all about.
Bill, do you think that the founders, would have looked, if they came forward to today and looked back on it, would they be surprised at the amount of litigation that has surrounded the Bill of Rights and our major constitutional cases, the fact that there are constituency groups around each one of the amendments for a large part, the fact that so much, it is somewhat the struggle between the individual, the state, and the federal government of power, and that all gets litigated. Do you think that would be a surprise to them?
I think what would be the first thing that would surprise them, if any of them were to magically come back from the beyond, they would be amazed at the size and the scope of the federal government. They would say, wait, you have a federal Department of Education? Where in the Constitution does it say that the federal government of the United States is going to have anything to do with education? That's properly left to the states and to the cities and to the counties, for goodness sake. That's not a federal thing. And what is this Health and Human Services? I'm not at all sure I understand why there's a federal department for that. I think that the founders would be amazed at the size and the scope of the government. As to the litigation, I think they would be pleased that Americans are still willing to look at the Constitution and look at what the government is doing and say, wait a minute, there's a mismatch here. The Constitution says you can do A, but you guys have taken that and you've decided to do A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. I don't think you can do that. And so they take the government to court. We take government to court all the time. The Second Amendment, 15 years ago in 2008, a famous case went before the Supreme Court about gun rights in the District of Columbia, and we have a ruling in 2008 about a right that was written into the Constitution in 1789. the Supreme Court is still opining on a regular basis. And in every term, we have the Supreme Court taking cases that go to these fundamental rights and interpreting who's right and who's wrong, and has the government overstepped its bounds. You've got, in the last term, you had Wheeling versus West Virginia, where we get to the question of whether or not the Congress can devolve power to a federal agency. If you go back and you go back to the ratification debates, or you go back to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and you look at what was their thinking about a legislative body, what is the purpose of a legislative body? You think about, we, the people, we're vesting power in the legislature. That's where the legislative function resides, not in an executive branch agency. So if an executive branch agency is reading the law that gives it the power to do A, B, and C, and they say, well, you know what, the Congress didn't say specifically what we're supposed to do about situation F, so we're going to make it up as we go along. For a long time, the legal doctrine in this country said, yeah, a government agency gets to do that. As long as they haven't been specifically prohibited by the Congress from doing something, they can go ahead and do it. Well, now we've got a Supreme Court that says, no, that's not the way it works. It's exactly the opposite. Unless the Congress specifically approves them doing it, then they can't do it. It's you guys, and this actually goes to the very fear from 232 years ago. Why is it that we have a Bill of Rights? We have a Bill of Rights because some people at the time were scared of what a future government would do. They were skeptical that all men would be as good as they all were. Let's face it, that was the best generation we've ever seen, the smartest collection of people we've ever seen. And they could count on one another, but remember what is the true genius of the American Constitution. It's the only Constitution that I've ever seen that actually deals with men and women as men and women really are. Remember, in that famous Federalist paper, Hamilton writes that ambition will be made to check ambition, and interest to check interest. What's he talking about? That's the separation of powers. The Constitution was written for the purpose of preventing the concentration of power in one place. They didn't want tyranny. Well, how do you do that? You separate powers. You give the powers to different branches of government. So we have three different branches of government. We have a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. And each of them are going to be populated by men and women who are greedy and avaricious and self-interested. And the legislature, being composed of greedy and avaricious and self-interested people, will not want the executive to take more power than it has been granted by the Constitution. They will not want the executive to take over part of the legislative function, because they would be taking power, that would be allowing the executive to take power away from them. They don't want to do that. They want to take power away from the executive, but the executive won't allow that either, and the judiciary isn't going to allow either of them. So that's the reason the Constitution works, because we have a separation of powers that builds into it. The way it operates is because it operates on a true understanding of the nature of men. We are greedy and avaricious and self-interested. You read some other countries' constitutions, read the old Soviet Constitution. Oh my gosh, the flowery language, the rights granted to the individual citizen in the Soviet Union were extraordinary. But it was just words on paper. That wasn't it. There was no way that it could have come to pass, because it relied on an understanding of human beings that simply didn't exist, that they were all perfect Soviet men. Well, if you could ever create them, maybe then it would work, but they never succeeded in creating them. Our Constitution works because it is based on a realistic understanding of who we are. And it takes those flaws and it turns them into features.
Yeah. In addition to those checks and balances that you see between the branches, the Bill of Rights also is a check and balance and things with the states and the federal government and individuals and things. I mean, we really try to disperse power across a variety of institutions and things there. Maybe speak to that, how it's played out and some of the implications.
Well, that's right. The separation of powers isn't just into three branches of government at the federal level. That's horizontal distribution of power. There's also a vertical distribution of powers. Some powers are reserved to the federal government. Some powers are reserved to the state governments. Some powers are reserved to the municipal government. So we've got a massive separation of powers working. In some cases, you say obviously some powers are better focused in the federal in the federal domain. The power to make war, obviously. We don't want South Carolina declaring war on the Bahamas. So South Carolina doesn't have the power to do that. The federal government of the United States has to make that decision. There are other things, though, where you want the states to be able to make those decisions. States obviously should have the say over what is the policy on taxation in their own state. They can make different decisions. And one of the things, it was not until 1934 in a Supreme Court case did we have Justice Louis Brandeis use the phrase laboratories of democracy. But that's something that's been going on for more than 200 years. And that is the notion that because certain functions of government we recognize are best left at the municipal level or at the state level, states and local governments can do different things. They can make different decisions. There are 9 states in this country right now that don't have a personal income tax. They don't use a personal income tax. Florida is probably the best known, and that's one of the reasons that, so many retirees want to move to Florida, because they're not going to be taxed on their personal income every year. There are other states that tax personal income very highly. New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, California, Illinois. These places tax the bejeebers out of people on personal income. As a laboratory of democracy, it's kind of interesting for those who are interested in tax policy. You can actually see the different tax structures that are set up and see, let's do a simple test. Are people moving into high tax states, or do they move to low tax states? Guess what? The laboratory operation here shows us that people tend to move into low tax states where you have, and the consequence is you have larger, better economic growth in those states where taxes are kept low than you have in states where taxes are kept high. You would think that the high tax states, if they were smart, would see the benefit of having lower taxes and would adjust accordingly. The fact that they don't is an indication that they're not really interested in achieving the best economic growth for their people. They're interested in making political points. Maybe ideologically they believe that wealth is a bad thing. I don't know. But the point is to get to the larger point of how this works in the constitutional construct. At the state and local level, we have these laboratories of democracy. We have different approaches based on different cultural characteristics, different geographic characteristics, different economic characteristics, different tradition and history comes into play.
It's fascinating too, because you see so many governors that have come to be president things. And I thought it was fascinating last week, and not speaking specifically to the politics or the election that we've got coming up, but the debate between Governor DeSantis and Governor Newsom, so Florida and California, and both of those governors talking about their states and the things that they felt like positive, and those that critical of the other things, and really giving the audience and some contrast about the things that they might want to do, and looking to a future contest where people are choosing to vote for the leader of our country. Having those laboratories of democracy out there is kind of an important thing to be able to pick from.
Well, you're absolutely right. And being a governor, if you want to get elected president of the United States, the surest route is to be first a governor of your state. We've elected 9 governors to the presidency. I think that the second best route is to be a general, frankly. Because we've elected more generals to the presidency than we have vice presidents. That's the third best route. Serve as somebody's vice president. Show that you can be the understudy to the job. But the reason, the reason that we go with governors is because the governor is basically, I'm going to use the phrase, he's the president of his state. What does he have? He has a power to tax. He has his own state police force. He has a National Guard that responds to his command. So he can actually, and he functions as a chief executive in that state. So he can actually develop a record. He can show, did the economy grow? What was crime like? What was the standard of living like? How about health care in my state? How about education levels in my state? Are people coming into my state because they hear it's a good place to live, or are they fleeing my state because they hear it's a terrible place to live? People can generate a record. And that, it turns out, is something that the American populace apparently responds to.
Well, it's leadership things too, and giving them a choice. So as we wind down, I wanted to just kind of conclude with, the inspiration that the American Bill of Rights has been across the globe. And from your experience, I know you talked specifically in regards to the experience in Russia and their change from the Soviet Union. But what have you seen as kind of a common theme of what folks outside of the United States look to with our American democratic, documents and things, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights? What do they draw the most inspiration from, and where is it has it been more of a beacon?
Well, I'll tell you just one story. When I was at the Heritage Foundation in the mid 1980s, one of the things that I wrote about was what was going on in the Third World. There were pro-democratic guerrilla insurgencies operating in the Third World. We had movements in Nicaragua and Angola and Afghanistan and Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and Ethiopia and Mozambique, and they all had one thing in common, and that is that they looked to the West, and specifically the United States, for inspiration. During those years in the mid-'80s, I would travel. I traveled extensively. I've been in 28 different countries working. One of them was Angola, and Angola is a very impoverished African country. It's got oil and it's got diamonds, natural resources that make it very attractive. It's also got a key strategic position on the west coast of Africa. So there was a war of national liberation that had been fought there for decades, beginning in the early 1960s. In the mid-'70s, Angola at the time was a Portuguese colony, and the Portuguese government gave up all of its colonies in Africa, and there was a quick power struggle, and a communist government came to power in 1974. And for about 20 years after that, there was an ongoing civil war where a group of Western rebels, Western allied rebels, were fighting against the communist government. And that was one of the groups that we supported at the Heritage Foundation. We supported these Angolan freedom fighters, and I went to visit them one time, and I was flown in at treetop level from southern Africa, and we landed on a dirt airstrip kind of thing, and then we'd drive for hours in a flatbed truck to get into the jungle compound. And so I finally arrive at the destination, and I'm being given a tour. And these are young Angolan teenage boys, basically, who they didn't know much. They hadn't had an education. They had been at war ever since they could remember, and from the time they were old enough to hold a gun, they had been taught how to hold and fire a gun. And here I come along, and I'm being introduced to guys who can't speak English. So I got a translator, and I'm being introduced as a supporter from America. And one of them, his eyes light up when he hears America. And he goes back into his little hut, and he comes back with his prized possession. It's a New York Yankees baseball hat that he had been given on a previous visit by a Western journalist. He had seen the NY, and he said, New York. And the journalist had thought kindly to give it to him as a memento. So this was his prized possession, this New York Yankees baseball hat. And he held it out to me. He says, New York, free speech. Wow. I didn't even know he knew how to speak English. I wondered, honestly, does he understand what free speech means? I don't know if he understands the complexities of free speech, but I know that the slogan means something to him, that free speech is associated with New York is associated with America. This was, I mean, when you stop to think of it, there's no TV. This is long before the internet. There wasn't any radio here. This is word of mouth getting to this young man in a hut in a jungle in southeastern Angola. But it was enough that it meant something to him, that when he was introduced to an American, he wanted to make a common bond, and he chose to do it the only way he knew how. New York, free speech. Okay. That's that has stuck with me. That was almost 40 years ago that event occurred in my life, and I'm remembering that guy's face as if it happened yesterday. That made an indelible mark on me. New York, free speech.
That is impactful. Thanks. And like I said, when we started off, what a vantage point to see history and to be a part of it, and to have, that reflection of American values presented back to you in a faraway place like Angola. So, fascinating stories. I appreciate you coming on and sharing kind of your background and perspective, as well as thoughts on the Bill of Rights. As we're celebrating that the 232nd anniversary here on December 15th. Our guest today has been Bill Pascoe. Bill will include your LinkedIn information and some contact information in the comment section below when we post this video out. But I can't thank you for being here and chatting with the GovExperts Insights audience. We like to talk about policy and politics and the practice of both, and you've given us a great example of that. So thank you very much, and appreciate you being on.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining this edition of GovExperts Insights. We invite you to follow this and other episodes at govexperts.com or on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and our other social media channels.